The Gestapo were once the most feared secret police in Europe, a shadowy force that enforced Nazi rule through intimidation and control. When the Third Reich collapsed, its leaders scattered, and the organization itself was branded a criminal organization. Yet the question lingered: what became of the men who ran it? Some stood trial as others vanished, and one, Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo's chief, seemed to disappear into thin air. In the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany crumbled under the weight of defeat. As Allied forces advanced into Berlin, the Gestapo, once the regime's most feared secret police, ceased to exist as an organized body. The institution, which had relied on the Nazi state for power and legitimacy, dissolved in a matter of weeks. Its officers fled, attempted to blend into civilian life, or surrendered to advancing armies. For the Allies, the Gestapo symbolized the machinery of repression, and dismantling it was a top priority. In June 1945, the Allied Control Council formally abolished all Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo. Their offices were closed, records were seized, and former officials were detained. Thousands of Gestapo files recovered from destroyed headquarters in Berlin and other cities became evidence for prosecutors preparing war crimes trials. These documents revealed the depth of the Gestapo's involvement in political persecution, forced labor, and the deportations that fed the Nazi camp system. The Allies recognized quickly that this was not an ordinary police force, it had been an arm of state terror. At the Nuremberg trials, which opened in November 1945, the Gestapo was placed on trial not as a collection of individuals but as an institution. Alongside the SS and the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, it was declared a criminal organization. The prosecution argued that anyone who had been part of the Gestapo shared responsibility for crimes committed under its authority. The most senior Gestapo leader in Allied custody, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, stood as the chief representative. As head of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, which controlled the Gestapo, he was held accountable for the actions carried out by its agents across Europe. Kaltenbrunner's trial revealed the breadth of Gestapo operations, from interrogations and executions to the deportation of Jews and resistance members. The evidence against him included both documents and testimony from survivors. In October 1946, he was sentenced to death and executed, the highest-ranking Gestapo figure to face justice. His conviction cemented the Gestapo's reputation as a criminal body, but it also raised questions about how far responsibility extended. Was every clerk or secretary equally guilty, or only those who gave the orders? In practice, denazification efforts varied across occupied zones. Some low-ranking Gestapo employees faced internment and questioning, while others slipped back into society with little notice. Local tribunals struggled with the sheer number of cases. Many former officials claimed they were merely following orders or performing routine police work. The Allies lacked the capacity to prosecute everyone, so decisions were often pragmatic. Some were punished severely, others quietly resumed careers in post-war Germany. Historians still debate whether the Nuremberg verdict against the Gestapo as an institution was effective in delivering justice. Some argue it set a necessary precedent, holding state agencies accountable for systemic crimes. Others suggest the ruling was largely symbolic, since only a fraction of Gestapo officials faced significant punishment. What is clear is that by the end of 1946, the Gestapo was no longer a functioning body, but a disbanded organization remembered primarily for its role in sustaining Nazi power. If the Gestapo as an institution was dismantled in 1945, its most senior surviving leader left behind one of the greatest mysteries of the post-war era. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo since 1939, was last seen in Berlin in the final days of the Third Reich. While Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler met their ends in clear circumstances, Müller seemed to vanish without a trace. Müller was present in Hitler's bunker during the collapse. Witnesses recalled him discussing the regime's fate and refusing to flee. After Hitler's death on April 30th, the bunker emptied, but Müller's movements remain uncertain. Some testified he left the Reichschancellery to fight on in Berlin, while others claimed they saw his body among the dead, none of which was ever confirmed. For Allied investigators, Müller became a prime target. He had overseen operations against resistance groups, coordinated deportations, and directed the Gestapo's brutal enforcement system. Capturing him could have revealed much about Nazi repression, but despite massive intelligence efforts, no verified trace was found. Rumors suggested escape to South America or recruitment by a foreign service, but none were ever substantiated. The mystery deepened during the Cold War. Both the CIA and Soviet intelligence service pursued leads, but neither produced conclusive evidence. In 2013, historian Johannes Tuchel announced that documents indicated Müller's body was discovered in May 1945 near the Luftwaffe Ministry and reburied in a mass grave in a Jewish cemetery in Berlin. If true, the man who orchestrated persecution ended up in the ground of a community his institution targeted. Not all historians are convinced, arguing the evidence remains circumstantial. For decades, the uncertainty around Müller's fate fed conspiracy theories and speculation. Whether he died in Berlin in 1945 or escaped undetected, he remains a symbol of the Gestapo's power and of the ambiguities of post-war justice. While Heinrich Müller's fate remained uncertain, the story of other Gestapo officials was far less mysterious. Across Europe, Allied authorities and local governments put hundreds of officers on trial. Yet the outcomes varied widely, from death sentences to short prison terms, and in some cases, freedom after only a few years. The uneven pursuit of justice revealed both the difficulty of prosecuting such a vast organization and the political priorities of post-war Europe. In Norway, the Gestapo had left a deep imprint on the occupation. Helmut Reinhardt, who headed the Gestapo there, was notorious for his harsh interrogations and repression of resistance members. After the war, he managed to disappear into the chaos of a defeated Germany. For nearly 2 decades, he lived under an assumed identity until 1964, when he was finally unmasked. In 1967, a West German court sentenced him to 5 years in prison, a surprisingly light punishment given his record. He was released in 1970 and lived quietly until his death in 2002. His case illustrates how many mid-level officials evaded immediate justice. Other trials ended more dramatically. Rudolf Christoph Batz, who served both as a Gestapo official and as a commander of Einsatzkommando II, initially escaped scrutiny after the war. He practiced law in post-war Hamburg until 1960, when investigators uncovered his past. Facing charges for his roles in deportations and killings, Batz was arrested. In 1961, shortly before his trial began, he took his own life in custody. Rudolf Kerner, who led the Gestapo in Kristiansand, Norway, faced a different fate. Arrested and tried by Norwegian authorities, he was sentenced to death in 1947. Yet political and legal shifts led to a commutation of his sentence to life imprisonment. Just 6 years later, in 1953, Kerner was released and returned to West Germany, where he lived as an ordinary shoe salesman. The contrast between his original sentence and his eventual release reflects the leniency that became more common during the 1950s, as Cold War priorities shifted attention away from punishing all former Nazis. These cases were far from unique. Thousands of Gestapo employees returned to civilian life in both West and East Germany. Some were barred from public service, while others managed to reintegrate into the police or civil administration. In West Germany, denazification programs lost momentum by the early 1950s, with many local courts reluctant to pursue further prosecutions. Some scholars question whether the Allies and later German governments truly sought accountability, or whether practical needs, such as staffing a functioning state, overrode moral concerns. The mixed results of these prosecutions reveal a stark reality. Only a fraction of Gestapo personnel ever faced lasting consequences. For many victims and survivors, this lack of comprehensive justice was a bitter reminder that the end of the war did not erase the scars left by Nazi terror. It also showed how quickly post-war societies shifted focus from retribution to reconstruction. While the Gestapo vanished as an institution, its methods of surveillance, intimidation, and political policing it pioneered did not disappear. Instead, they shaped debates about how a modern democracy could prevent state power from sliding back into tyranny. In West Germany, public memory of the Gestapo developed slowly. Survivors of persecution testified in courts and published memoirs, but many former officials blended into post-war society. Practical concerns, rebuilding infrastructure, stabilizing the economy, and resisting Soviet influence took precedence. As a result, some ex-Gestapo employees re-entered police work or civil service under the new German Republic. Historians still argue whether this continuity undermined West Germany's early democratic culture or whether it represented a necessary compromise in the Cold War environment. In East Germany, the story took a different turn. The new socialist state emphasized its anti-fascist identity, using the Gestapo as a symbol of capitalist oppression. The Ministry for State Security, better known as the Stasi, became the regime's own secret police. While ideologically different, the Stasi borrowed heavily from Gestapo methods, cultivating informants, monitoring citizens, and crushing dissent. For many East Germans, this continuity reinforced the idea that authoritarian surveillance had simply changed uniforms rather than disappeared. Internationally, the Gestapo became a byword for repression. War crimes trials in Europe set legal precedents for prosecuting crimes against humanity and for holding organizations, not just individuals, responsible. The Nuremberg Declaration that the Gestapo was criminal was groundbreaking, even if it was not consistently enforced. It served as a warning that state agencies could no longer hide behind claims of legality when committing systemic abuses. Over time, scholarship has also reshaped our understanding of the Gestapo. Early portrayals emphasized its all-powerful, omnipresent reach. More recent research, based on captured records, suggests a more complex picture. The Gestapo was feared, but much of its work relied on denunciations from ordinary citizens. Some scholars question whether the Gestapo's effectiveness lay in its organization or in the willingness of neighbors and colleagues to turn on one another. Today, memorials and museums across Germany highlight the Gestapo's role in the Nazi system of control. The former Gestapo headquarters in Berlin now houses the Topography of Terror Museum, documenting both the institution and the crimes it oversaw. Education programs seek to ensure that the memory of repression is preserved, not only as history, but as a warning against authoritarianism in the present. Though the Gestapo as an institution ended in 1945, it remains one of the starkest reminders of how a modern state can twist law enforcement into an instrument of fear. Well, that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, check out our other deep dives into figures who shaped World War II. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next video. And we'll see you in the next one.